When J.P. Morgan backed out of the Titanic's voyage, he thought he'd avoided a gruesome death. He was wrong. When it came for him a year later, it was utterly horrific. J.P. Morgan is a household name, but what about the man behind the bank? Morgan's business sense revolutionized the entire landscape of America and rocketed him into a life few could dream of. But money certainly couldn't buy his happiness. Morgan couldn't escape the past that haunted him, and though he climbed to the apex of society, eventually his secrets caught up, and no trust fund could save him from his fate. Born into the already well-established Morgan family in 1837 in Connecticut, John Pierpont Morgan had everything he needed from the moment he was born, and it showed. By the time JP was 10, his father inherited a fortune from his father and would become a partner in a banking firm. Even his mother brought unusual prestige to the family, hailing from a line of poets, including the composer of Jingle Bells.
Please subscribe and help me reach 1,000 subscribers. Your one comment and one push can truly change my life.
Still, there were a few things that even the Morgans couldn't protect their young son from. At 15, Morgan contracted an illness that bloomed into a painful rheumatic fever. Although his father sent Morgan to Portugal to convalesce, it took him a full year to recover, and even then he suffered from flare-ups of pain for the rest of his life. This brush with death, perhaps, only made Morgan more determined to leave a mark upon the world. His father obliged, sending him to both Switzerland and Germany to study and providing his son with his first job. For the next 14 years, Morgan built up his reputation on Wall Street in his father's business, carving out a name for himself. Eventually, though, Morgan tired of working under his father's shadow. He dreamed of something more. While working for Duncan, Sherman and Company, Morgan operated in the South, ostensibly to learn the cotton trade. But when he saw an opportunity to make a trade on coffee at a profit, he took it, even though his company hadn't authorized the move. The bank chastised him, but now around 22, Morgan hardly took the warning. Instead, even then he began planning, alongside his father, to go into business for himself. But his best-laid business plans never expected the next twist. In the summer of 1859, Morgan met Amelia Sturgis and fell deeply in love. After 2 years of courting, they knew they wanted to marry. It was too bad that by that point, they had already waited too long. At some point during their courtship, Sturgis contracted tuberculosis, and by the day of their wedding, most would have accepted that Sturgis was too far gone. Most might have, but not J.P. Morgan. The pair married in October 1861, and Sturgis was so ill that she lacked the energy to even make it to the ceremony. Instead, Morgan had to carry her to the drawing room, where they tied themselves together in a small private ceremony. Following the wedding, Morgan yet again carried his bride to the carriage that transported them to the pier for their honeymoon in Algiers. Why Algiers? Well, they had promised to love each other until death do us part, and Morgan still refused to accept that parting might be sooner rather than later. He hoped the warm weather would return them both to full health, insistent that he could make whatever dream he had a reality. Morgan remained married to Sturgis for a little over 4 months, such a short time that every hour counted. At some point, the couple had traveled to Nice, and Sturgis saw out the rest of her days there, passing in February 1862. Her parting shattered what desires Morgan held for romance. With nothing else left, he poured his grief and energy into what he'd always known: business. At some point in early 1861, Morgan opened his first private company, J. Pierpont Morgan and Company. Only this endeavor had its own bloody problems. During this time, America erupted into the Civil War, and the Union needed men to fight for them. Men exactly like the young J.P. Morgan. The trouble was, Morgan thought he was put to better use elsewhere. And when the draft pulled his name, he finally had a problem his money could solve. Morgan bought his way out of the draft, paying another man $300 to take his place in the Union Army. Having settled that matter, Morgan was left free to focus on his business, which was roiling thanks to the volatile economic climate the war produced. Before the Civil War, Morgan worked primarily in the cotton business as well as iron imports for the railroads. Unfortunately, both of these things disappeared as the battles began. Fortunately, Morgan hadn't gotten this far without being versatile. He also hadn't gotten this far without being willing to bend or even break a rule or two. He now took advantage of his connections in England to ensure that he continued to make a profit, even while his fellow Americans suffered. Shortly after the loss of his dear Amelia, Morgan manipulated the markets to ensure that he came out the winner. He and his then partner made a large profit off the sale of their holdings in gold. As average Americans went down, Morgan rose up. The move had its critics, but by this point, it was the least of Morgan's worries. He'd already tarnished his name. Everything started to go downhill when Morgan loaned Simon Stevens, a New York attorney, $20,000. Stevens then used that money to purchase 5,000 carbine rifles, which he turned around to sell a general of the American government for twice the price. Thanks to his loan, Morgan turned a pretty profit from the exchange. Tensions at the time were running high, and the House of Representatives would call all profiteers, like this, worse than traitors in arms. Even worse, when public interest in this deal rose again in 1910, new information made Morgan look even more reprehensible. Not only did the general overpay for the rifles, but they were defective, likely to explode out of the back instead of firing properly. Both through legitimate means and questionable acts, Morgan saw success throughout this period. By the time the Civil War ended, the public viewed his company as a strong and reliable banking house. As the 1860s carried on, Morgan continued to see success, investing in more and more businesses, and even indulging in some products that some people might find unsavory. In fact, there was almost nothing that Morgan wouldn't trade in, including excrement. Based on the advice of the vice president, in 1865, Morgan decided his next big move should be in poop. He negotiated a contract to be the exclusive importer of guano from Peru, which was used in fertilizer and gunpowder. That same year, Morgan must have overcome his heartbreak from the loss of Amelia, as that May saw him waiting for another woman at the end of the aisle. This time, Morgan married Frances Louisa Fanny Tracy. Together they would have 4 children, but this outward image of success was hiding a darker truth. Though likely fond of Fanny when they married, it didn't appear to stay that way for Morgan. By 1890, he was thoroughly tired of his marriage and proceeded to spend nearly all of his time with women who were not his wife. Morgan didn't sleep around so much as practice extramarital serial monogamy. He spent time with one woman before moving on to another one, rather than stringing several along at the same time. And he had the wealth and charisma to back this up. He never seemed to have problems finding a new companion or even new friends. According to one man, a visit from Morgan left him with the feeling as if a gale had blown through the house. Nonetheless, the force of Morgan's personality couldn't overcome the affliction that ravaged his face, leading the larger-than-life man to hide away from the public and, at times, lash out. By the time he reached his 40s, Morgan began to suffer from a condition that caused the skin on his nose to deform, twisting with pits, nodules, and fissures, all of which gave his nose a large, bulbous appearance as well as a purplish hue. Unable to bear the stigma, he often hermited himself away. Morgan also refused to have pictures taken of him unless they were professionally retouched, and he could attack if surprised by a photographer. Unsurprisingly, the public response to this was less than kind, and Morgan heard taunts like, "Johnny Morgan's nasal organ has a purple hue." What was surprising was the fact that Morgan didn't need to live like this at all. In some ways, he chose this affliction. Medical practices had evolved enough during his lifetime that Morgan could have had the growths removed from his nose. However, he refused to undergo surgery. His son-in-law suspected that the reason for this linked back to Morgan's childhood, and a fear that he'd never been able to shake, even into old age. As a child, in addition to the rheumatic fever, Morgan suffered from infantile seizures, and his family suspected that he feared the procedure on his nose would induce them again. In any case, Morgan couldn't take the risk. He had too much to lose. J.P. Morgan proved to be such a successful businessman that by the turn of the century, everyone depended upon him, even the U.S. government. Twice, in 1895 and again in 1907, the United States sat on the brink of financial crisis. As a downturn threatened the livelihoods of many Americans, and the U.S. government had dwindled its gold reserves down to almost nothing, J.P. Morgan provided them with what they needed, saving the Treasury, though sinking President Grover Cleveland's career in the process. In 1907, matters proved a little more complicated. The American bank system was in crisis, with major banks facing bankruptcy and no government safety net to save them. In response, Morgan once more overpowered the situation, playing a major role in the reallocation of funds between banks and trusts. Of course, he got something out of it, conveniently removing his competition. When one firm, Moore & Schley, couldn't repay its loans, Morgan proposed a solution. His own company, U.S. Steel, would absorb Moore & Schley. Gaining special permission from President Roosevelt, U.S. Steel absorbed its competition, turning into a virtual monopoly. The crisis ended, and somehow Morgan ended up even better off than he'd been before. Or so it looked. By the 1900s, J.P. Morgan & Co. was a well-established company. They invested in many other companies, including the International Mercantile Marine Co., an Atlantic shipping company that itself controlled many smaller shipping lines, among them the White Star Line. If you think the White Star Line sounds familiar, that's because it should be. In 1912, the White Star Line had banked all of its fortunes on their latest luxury liner, the biggest unsinkable ship ever made, the RMS Titanic. Accordingly, the big boss, J.P. Morgan, intended to set sail on the Titanic's maiden voyage. He'd bought one of their luxury suites, complete with his private promenade deck. But whatever light that guided J.P. Morgan led him to safety again. At the last minute, he changed his plans, and the Titanic set sail without him. When the news came in of its sinking, Morgan knew he'd saved his life that day, while other wealthy Americans, like John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man aboard the Titanic, lost their lives. Morgan's financial investments didn't get so lucky. When the Titanic sank, it took the White Star Line and International Mercantile Marine Co. with it. Nonetheless, Morgan showed social grace in this tragedy, announcing, "Monetary losses amount to nothing in life. It is the loss of life that counts. It is that frightful death." But though Morgan had narrowly avoided this grim future, his past now caught up with him. The fever that Morgan suffered from as a teen never fully went away, and near the end of his life, it now robbed him of even the ability to walk. Just a year after the sinking of the Titanic, Morgan went into a rapid decline, and while never publicly associated with that original illness, it likely brought back the horrors he felt all those years before. His downward fall started with extreme weakness, and eventually his own body began to rebel against him. When he attempted to speak, his throat contracted, stopping him from doing so. Then, fear surely took over Morgan when he realized that not only could he not speak, but he couldn't eat. The muscles in his throat had ceased to work entirely. The only thing Morgan could do now to escape his suffering was sleep. Most people avoid thinking about the end, but if forced to focus on it, they say they wish for it to be quick. For all his money and wealth, that proved to be one of the only things that Morgan couldn't buy. Instead, he spent the last weeks of his life suffering from a long sinking spell that caused him to meet his end slowly, one painful step at a time. J.P. Morgan died on March 31st, 1913, having spent much of the days before that slipping in and out of consciousness, being sustained by injections as he could no longer consume food. Traveling abroad, his life ended in Rome, Italy. The man who had been larger than life returned home in a box, and the empire that he built waited to honor him. The stock market closed for 2 hours in observance of his death, a custom usually reserved for heads of state. J.P. Morgan revolutionized the banking system, saving Wall Street several times over. Even so, his critics accuse him of creating a still-present culture where the few control the bulk of the wealth. Both things can be true, as can the fact that J.P. Morgan changed the world, for better or worse. If you'd like to hear about more fascinating figures like this, please like and subscribe to our page.